Hi, this is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Stories of the Supernatural. Wherever you find us, whether it's a video or podcast on your favorite platform, please like and subscribe to us so that you can get notification of when a new show is released. You can also find us on major social media platforms. If you go to MiamiGhostChronicles.com, you can find links to the videos or MP3 files, which you can download and enjoy without commercial interruptions. If you're into classic horror, ghost, and adventure stories, I narrate Nightshade Diary, and you can find links at nightshadediary.com. If scary stories are your bag, and listening to encounters with cryptids, ghosts, dogman, and other weird creatures sends a shiver up your spine, then go to supernaturalstorytime.com for links to our weekly podcasts. Noteworthy news about the paranormal world, true crime, conspiracy stories, and anything that is just plain weird can be found at eerie.news or visit the Stranger Than Fiction Stories tab at miamighostchronicles.com. Please subscribe to my newsletter on Substack. Just go to mppellicer.com for a link. I want to thank you for being part of my audience, and I think you are all wonderful. Good. I hope everything is good over here and during the rest of the heat wave that everybody is, feeling. Hot. I'm telling you, it's in the 90s. I'm spraying down my animals, spraying down myself. Like I tell everybody, I'm a weather wimp. Unless I have to, absolutely, I'm staying in the AC unless it's early morning or late afternoon. And yeah, it's crazy. It is crazy, but yeah, well, even in North Florida, the weather has gotten. Yesterday we got some rain and it felt good. It felt good. So yeah, I'm seeing. When I look at the weather usually for the entire United States, and yeah, there's some crazy weather going on out there. As far as I've heard that the North Atlantic has never been as heated as it is now, like ever. And we have El Nino. This is for Florida people, which will hopefully save us in Florida from getting any hurricane action. Not from them forming, but at least them arriving on our shores. Because when you've lived through that, you always keep an eye out there, even if you're not really in Hurricane Alley anymore. So let's get on to the good part. And the good part is the guest for today. This gentleman's name is David Brody. This is the first time he's on Stories of the Supernatural. He's a 10-time Amazon #1 best-selling fiction writer with over 500,000 books sold. His children call him a rock nerd because of the time he spent studying ancient stone structures, which he believes are evidence of exploration of America prior to Columbus. He has served as a director of NEARA, which stands for New England Antiquities Research Association, and has appeared as a guest expert on documentaries airing on History Channel, Travel Channel, PBS, and Discovery Channel. He's a graduate of Tufts University and Georgetown Law School. He was raised in Laconia, New Hampshire, raised a family in Westford, Massachusetts, and currently resides in Newburyport, Massachusetts, with his wife, sculptor Kimberly Scott. Help me welcome him. How are you doing today, David?
Doing great, thank you. I heard your commentary on the North Atlantic warming up. We live right on the North Shore in Massachusetts. And today, for the first day, we had a wind coming off the ocean, and I figured it was going to be nice and cool, like the air conditioner.
Mm-hmm.
And it was 89 degrees, and I was like, "Wow!"
Right.
I said to my wife, "The Atlantic must be really warm because normally when we get that kind of breeze, it really cools things off, and it didn't today." So you're spot on.
Yes, it was, and I grew up in South Florida because of the hurricanes. So especially in the summer this is traditionally hurricane season, all the way up to November. You always look at the weather all over the place. And that's why normally I wouldn't have noticed this, but I did notice that they've have this superheated North Atlantic waters, which you think of the North Atlantic as being cold water, something that they've never seen before. And, and of course they talk about the, El Nino, La Nina, as far as the La Nina is basically what's going to help anybody from any of those hurricanes coming over here. They'll form, but, there's a whole explanation for it. But yeah, I always look at those things because, and then you get some crazy weather out there. They're expecting, even though we're months away from winter. I was reading somewhere that they were expecting like inches of snow in Southern California. You remember like last year that it was really weird that they had weird weather, stuff like that. So, yeah.
It
One of
was
those
great for
deals.
skiers. It was great for skiers out in the Rockies last
Oh
year.
yeah. Oh
Amazing.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
It's
Yeah.
interesting. We'll talk about like the whole idea of exploration of America before Columbus, but a big part of that in ancient times was the weather patterns, like allowing, during the mini ice ages and stuff, and
Mm,
that would spur, or that would encourage people to go out looking for warmer climates if the crops weren't coming in because it was so cold. And also the wind patterns would allow people to cross the Atlantic at certain times. So all of
sure.
that is related to ancient exploration.
Right.
Sort of
Right. Because you
segue into what
think,
we'll talk about later today.
let me ask, how did you get started on this? Was it just something that you stumbled on that interested you, and the more you researched it, how did you come about it as far as getting interested in this field?
Yeah, so I really did stumble upon it literally. So I'm a lawyer by trade, and like a lot of
Hmm.
lawyers, I always wanted to write fiction. That's one of the things that, a lot of people who end up in law school got there because they were good writers. And at that point in your life, you can either go become a journalist or go get a master's in writing or whatever. So I ended up in law school, but I always wanted to write. And I had written three legal thrillers, and
Okay.
while I was practicing law. And I was working on what I thought would be my fourth legal thriller. And my daughter came home from school. She was in fourth grade at the time, and this was back at the time when your kids actually answered you when you said what did you do in school, and they're young enough to actually tell you, as opposed to as they got older,
Right.
teenagers, they would just sort of say nothing. But
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
we learned about um, exploration of America before Columbus. She said Prince Henry Sinclair came to America in 1398, and I was like, "What are you talking about?" And there was these Scottish explorers who came to. We live in Westford, Massachusetts at the time. So they came to Westford, and she explained to me that there was this whole historical site in the middle of town, in the town that we lived in, a marker and a monument, and this whole explanation, this whole legend that Scottish explorers had come to Massachusetts 100 years before Columbus. So I thought, well, that's interesting. That would be a fun thing to include in a book. And so
Right.
I went to the library and started doing research, and I went down that rabbit hole. And literally, here I am, 16 years later, 16 books later, still down that rabbit hole, still ferreting around in the dusty corners of history, in desperate need of a change of clothes and a shower at this point. But
But let me ask you, because you always grew up with that traditional, Columbus discovered America, blah blah blah, and the Puritans,
1939,
that timeline kind of deal. When
yeah.
you started looking into it, were you surprised to find that wasn't exactly accurate, or that there was some type of something
So, so I
that
have a
that
memory.
offered an alternate? How's that?
Yeah, so Marlene, I have a memory in second grade. I was up in New Hampshire, Laconia, New Hampshire. My teacher, Mrs. North, I still remember to this day,
Hmm.
and she put a historical timeline across the chalkboard, and it
Right,
started with like the Vikings in the year 1001, and that was when
right,
Lee Erickson and his gang came back and forth to maritime Canada, to Newfoundland and New Brunswick and Nova Scotia,
right.
Finland, and they came back and forth 6 or 7 times. And then in the timeline, there was a whole big gap of almost 500 years until Columbus, and then it started filling in again. And I raised my little hand and I said, "How come if they knew how to get here, if the Vikings and the Norse knew how to get here, how come it took 500 years for somebody to come back again?" And she looked at me sort of and gave me a little knowing nod and said, David, that's an interesting question. Maybe someday you can try to answer that.
Oh
So
boy, did she!
God bless her
That
for
was
doing.
incredible.
Yeah.
That's
So in
incredible.
the back of my mind, it always occurred to me because we talked about why the Vikings would have wanted to come here, because it was a land of plenty. There was
Right.
fishing. There was timber. A lot of Scandinavia had been deforested, and if you're a maritime society like the Vikings were, you need tall trees to make your ships.
To
So there
make
was
your ships.
timber. There was trading with the natives. There was furs. There was just a lot going on here. Land, of course. There was a lot of really good resources, and we talked about those in second grade in the class. And then for some reason, there seemed to be no need for any Europeans ever to come back to continue to harvest those resources. That didn't make a lot of sense to me. So, um,
Right.
I didn't really refocus on it. But when my daughter came back and told me that story, and I started doing the research, I realized that probably what had happened was that the Norse had come over here in the early parts of the 11th century. and for whatever reason, they didn't stay for more than a decade or two. They brought that news back to Scandinavia and to Europe, and other
Right.
groups came over also, but they kept it secret. It was like if you have a favorite fishing hole, you don't tell
I was
anybody.
gonna say that people don't realize back then. I can imagine if you discovered where you were gonna get whatever you kept it a secret. You didn't want anybody
Economic
else to.
advantage, right?
Yeah, yeah. Especially this thing of share alike back then. You know, if you have that information, we have a way to get over there. You're not about to tell anybody.
Yeah.
Hey,
So it occurred to me when I started doing the research that probably what had happened was that there were waves of explorers going back and forth. And of course, we also learned when we were back in elementary school that the 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 Europeans back then believed that the Earth was flat, and if you went too far, you'd
sure,
fall off the end, or that there were sea monsters out there. That's not true. I mean, the church wanted you to believe that, but most people,
sure.
most educated people back then understood that the Earth was round. They could see the ship sailing off the horizon, and at
Right,
the end,
and
you could only see the top of the mast. So they understood all that, and especially people who were navigators in the maritime industry, they
mm-hmm,
understood the Earth was round, and they understood you weren't going to get eaten by sea monsters out there. So all that was just sort of propaganda. Um,
right.
but and they definitely, they had boats. Um, bigger than Columbus. So that
Yeah,
so they knew how to do it. And so I think what was happening, I'm repeating myself. So I think what happened was that there have been waves of explorers using the Atlantic Ocean not as a barrier, but as a highway,
well,
and that
if I understand, isn't there routes? Because we always think of them traversing the middle of the Atlantic, like but I believe that there's ways that you can be very close to land
yes, you're exactly
and
right.
get over here. It's not
Exactly.
that you're going to go out in the middle of the ocean with nothing in sight.
Yeah, no,
There's
you could
way
go.
there's ways to get here without going out into the middle of nowhere. In other words,
Yeah. So what we think the explorers my daughter was talking about when she came back from fourth grade that day were were explorers who left from northern Scotland, the Orkney
right?
Islands, and they would have island hopped like you said,
Mm-hmm.
Marlene, from the Orkney Islands to the Faroe Islands to the Shetland Islands to Iceland to Greenland to Labrador in Canada down to Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and then potentially down to New England. Where we think they ended up, but like you said, you were never really out of sight of the next landmass if you did it that
Right.
way. It was a little
Exactly.
bit tough because the prevailing winds were against you at some time, but you could do it. You didn't have to cross
Uh-huh.
the belly of the Atlantic. You could go across the North Atlantic, if you did it at the right time of year.
Right,
And
which is what you were saying originally about the weather, that being important. Because
yes,
and that I think if any seafaring or navigating society, they're very aware of the weather. And once you took that, everybody knew that in certain months you're going to have colder weather or maybe something it's iced over. Um,
right. It was that, and also the ability to sail into the wind once they figured out the technology for sailing into the wind, and then also once they and this goes back to the ancient Phoenicians, the idea of
mhm,
navigating by the stars. And once you figured
sure.
out that whole thing, so again, the Norse did it in the 11th century. So to me, it would have been surprising if 500 years passed and nobody came back. And so now
Right.
it's the question of, okay, we think it's possible. Now there's this legend of Prince Henry Sinclair in 1398, and we have different pieces of evidence. And as a lawyer, that's how I look at things. We had evidence. Can we find more evidence, or instead, do we need to refute the evidence we have? Is it probative? Can it be contradicted? Evidence to me is how I look at
Right.
these things, and start looking at the artifacts. The artifacts themselves are the evidence. Is there evidence? Are there artifacts that show that this group of people, Prince Henry Sinclair in this case, were here around 1398 or thereabouts? Is there enough evidence to build the case? And
Right.
as a lawyer, that's what
Right.
I
And
did.
it almost seems like, yeah, later on, when more like after Columbus, that there was more of an establishment. But it seems like, yeah, like some of the earlier people that arrived here were here and stayed for a while, but never really developed it fully for who knows what reason. Maybe there was problems with the natives, or maybe
Right.
they just used it as a, hey, we're going to go out there, but they just never had the need of making a bigger and bigger town, like an
So I
established
think one of
town.
the important things that happened was if you go back to the time period where I'm talking, 11th century or even 14th
Right.
century. The Europeans didn't have gunpowder yet. That was
Okay.
a big change. So if they were to come here and the natives were here, the natives
Sure.
would have been able to chase them off pretty easily.
Sure.
Once we get to the 1600s or even the late 1500s, we've got gunpowder, and now that
Hmm.
changes the balance of power. Now the Europeans can arrive and stake a claim, and it's harder to uproot them because of their advantage in weaponry. But
Sure.
going back earlier, like you said, they they probably could have come if they had good relations with the natives, traded and done so
Hmm.
respectfully, and shared um, shared their cultural values with each other. That would have worked. But if they came over here and just tried to sort of impose themselves on the natives, they wouldn't have been able to.
Right. And from what I understand, was one time I was reading an account of there's a gentleman, Quaker, he got shipwrecked here off the coast of Florida. This was like in the 1700s. But you could have one tribe be nice and welcoming, and then you walk down a little bit, and once you're in the territory of another tribe, they would want to kill you. In other
Yeah,
words, it wasn't just once one. You had to worry constantly as far as getting along with certain natives. They weren't all the same. They had different ideas
no,
about
they were
intruders.
fighting each other a lot. I mean, a lot of the natives, for a long
Yes.
time, there were constant conflict between the native tribes in America
Yes.
for that very reason. Like you said, they were not one united tribe. There were
No.
many different tribes. And so part of the key to all this, I think, we haven't talked about this yet, but part of one of the
Mhm.
key things about my research is that this group that came over in 1398, Prince Henry Sinclair, who was a prince of Scotland, and by the way, although he was Scottish, his mother was Norse, so he would have had this family history, the knowledge
Right.
of his ancestors having come over, the Norse sagas, the Norse coming over to North America, the Leif Erikson sagas. His family would have known about that, probably had maps and charts. So again, he was
Exactly.
Scottish, but also half Norse. But he, on his father's side, the Scottish side, he descended from a long line of Knights Templar, and the
Right.
Templars had been outlawed in the early 1300s, and we're talking the late
Mhm.
1300s. But just because the Templars were outlawed doesn't mean they disappeared. It just means they
Sure.
went underground and reconstituted themselves as different groups. But um, the Templars may have, there's a lot of evidence the Templars had come over here periodically prior even to Prince Henry Sinclair. Um, and when they did come, and this is based on some Native American legends,
Mhm.
the Mi'kmaq tribe and the Wampanoag tribe have these legends here in the States about the Templars coming here. But the Templars, when they came in peace. They came respectfully, and they traded with the natives and built an alliance and forged a friendship. And it was because of that they were welcomed here and were able to come back and forth. If you remember when Columbus finally came back in 1492, on
Mhm.
his sails he had the Templar cross, which is
Okay.
interesting. The Templars had been outlawed by then, but I think what Columbus was doing was he understood that the Templars had come here before, and the natives would recognize that cross on the sails as, oh, these
Right.
are friends. These are our friends,
Exactly.
the
Right.
Templars.
Like the
Columbus
symbol.
was welcome when he first arrived. He ended up being an SOB to them, but at first when
Yeah,
he
I know, but he was smart enough to know without knowing exactly what I'm going to encounter. Let me make it look like I'm coming in peace, kind of deal. I come in
exactly,
peace,
yeah, I mean
and
he was not, he did not treat the natives well, but I think the reason he flew the Templar flag on his Templar cross on his sails was because he knew that he'd be welcome because the Templars had been here before, and again including Prince Henry Sinclair. So that's sort of the overview of all this, is that the Sinclair group was welcomed here because they were part of the Templar continuum, and the Templars had been coming over here periodically, and they were welcome, had forged an alliance. And so when Sinclair arrived, I have a friend who's a Wampanoag tribal chief, and he always said, when Sinclair arrived and they built something called the Newport Tower, we'll get to that later.
right,
If we wanted to, we would have kicked their ass back to Europe. Like that's what he says.
right,
The only way Sinclair and his group would have been allowed to build something like that is if the Native Americans said, "Okay, you can," gave
sure,
permission, and that's a
exactly,
key part of this. That didn't happen later on when the Pilgrims came, but earlier on, the reason why the Sinclair group was allowed to come and sort of do what they wanted was because they'd forged a friendship. They came respectfully.
And I don't know if also an impetus to this was because of the Black Death, the plague that was going on in Europe around the same time,
Yeah.
where, you know, I know that a lot of people say, but at some point, I think people back then understood the idea of quarantining as far as that you need to get away from whoever is sick. They might not have understood the mechanics of how this was spread, but they understood the idea of leaving, of going away from where the sickness is, in other words.
Right. They
So,
didn't understand the cause, but they did understand that getting away from it was probably a good idea.
sure.
And there was a lot going on in Europe at the time. A lot
Yes.
of reasons, even just going back to the feudal system and going back to the primogenital system, where if you were the second or third son, and your older brother
Yeah.
inherited everything, like there's no land for you. There wasn't enough land left,
Nothing. It
so
was
you have to
sorry.
go seek your fortune. Go west, go seek your fortune. That included going west across the Atlantic. Um,
Yeah, that's
but
why
there were
you
a
would
lot.
see all these second and third sons go off to the
Sure.
church or become soldiers or something. And
Right. If you didn't want to do that, you wanted to seek your fortune, that.
yes,
So, and there were once one or two groups or ships had come back and forth, people talk and there are stories. And it's like, okay, what's out there? What's out there across the Atlantic? And the stories are, it's a land of plenty. There's lots of resources. There's lots of economic advantages. Yes, it's a long way, but you can go across the islands. You just have to be careful. You have to know when to sail.
let me
So
ask you: do you
I asked
think the
myself,
Templars,
later, like, why wouldn't they have gone?
considering, I'm going to go to the Templar idea, considering what happened to them, as far as that they were basically hunted down by the church, and
Yes.
you know whatever. Do you think that they came over here because it was like, over there we know that we could put our stuff away and no, there's nobody out there. There's no set of eyes. The natives out there aren't going to call the Pope or send a message to the Pope and say, "Hey, they're over here."
Yeah.
You know, I think that maybe
So
it was
exactly.
just
So there was something in the early 1200s called the Albigensian Crusade, and that was
yes,
the first time in history where people were murdered just because of their religion. That's the first time we've ever had a religious genocide in the history of the world. And what that was the the Catholic Church wiping out other Christians in
hmm,
France because they were practicing a different version of Christianity than that which was sanctioned by the Church and the Pope,
sure,
the Vatican. And they basically were told, you got to stop, doing this religious rituals and ignoring your priests. And people
right,
said, this is our religion. And anyway, so they wiped them out. So I think when the Templars saw that in the 1220-ish time period, the Templars realized, like, whoa, we have some different ideas about Christianity. Again, they had been over in Jerusalem in the early
right,
parts of the 1100s, so about 100 years earlier. And I think they learned a lot of things about the way the world worked, which people in
hmm,
Europe had lost track of during the Dark Ages. And they began to question, the Templars themselves began to question the church and the church
sure,
teaching. And I think they saw the writing on the wall. If that could happen to the Albigensians, basically the Cathars is who it was,
right. The
in,
Cathars, exactly,
it can happen to us. And so they felt like they needed to prepare and have a safe haven to go
exactly.
to if and when the church turned on them. So there's evidence that in the prior to the whole 1398 Prince Henry Sinclair thing, there's evidence that the Templars had come over here many times and again forged relationships with the natives, perhaps brought their Templar treasure over
Right.
here for safekeeping. But in either event, they knew about the land here and were using it, just as you said, Marlene, as a place, as a refuge in
It's a
case things
stash
got
house. How's that?
dicey in Europe.
This is because I'm thinking, a- anywhere that they could have gone in Europe, wherever, UK, France, Gaul, whatever, Spain, all these places, there were going to be eyes, because all these power, whether it was a king or the Pope, they all had spies all over the place. So they
Well,
knew, I'm
and
thinking
more
it
to
would
the
be
point,
difficult to hide out in Europe. It's
yeah,
like,
more to the point, they were all Catholic. So
yeah,
if once the Vatican basically condemned the Templars, outlawed the Templars. Now, if you're Catholic, if you're a Catholic monarch of any kind, whatever you
Yeah.
are in Europe, you're gonna probably be inclined to be the eyes of the Vatican, as you said. The one
Sure.
safe haven they did have was Scotland, because at that time Robert the Bruce ruled Scotland. He had been excommunicated for murdering somebody in the church, and
Hmm.
so he welcomed the Templars came up, and he was fighting the English, and the Templars helped. That whole the Battle of Bannockburn, Mel Gibson
Right.
and Braveheart, all that stuff. The Templars came in and helped, and so he welcomed them. And so there was a safe haven up in Scotland for the Templars, which is where they originally went after they were outlawed, many of them. But again, they knew eventually that even Scotland might not be safe for them, and from Scotland, that was a jumping off point to continue over to America.
Let me ask you, in the research that you've come across, do you think it's possible or real that they did find things when they were in Jerusalem during the
Very much.
Crusades, as far as, like you said, whether it's manuscripts or even the Ark of the Covenant? You hear all these theories about things they might have found, like you said, that they decided for whatever reason, we cannot ever let anybody know we have found this.
Very much. So they found, so the original Templars, there were 9 of them.
Hmm.
And the idea was they were supposedly going there to protect pilgrims who were coming to the Holy Land
Right.
to visit the sites. But I mean, 9 guys aren't going to really do much, in a land that large. But what they did do is they spent a number of years excavating under the old the ruins of King Solomon's temple, and they found something. Everyone seems to agree that on that, and whatever it was that they found, they somehow leveraged that into the church granting them all sorts of rights and privileges that nobody else had. So they found something, and they either convinced the church that they should be entitled to these rights and privileges, or they blackmailed the church into giving them.
Right.
No one's quite sure what, but something they found, whether it was secrets, true secrets of Christianity from the early days that the church didn't want told,
Hmm.
religious artifacts such as the Ark of the Covenant, like you said, um, secrets of medicine or architecture or navigation.
Right.
Who knows what it was? I mean, I'm not sure we'll ever know. I mean, maybe if we were able to get into the Vatican archives, we would have answers. But whatever it was, they were able to leverage it into this position of power, so that within about 20 or 30 years, they had become probably the most powerful force in all of Europe, other than the church itself. They
Right,
became
because
incredibly.
they eventually got into banking, right? If I'm
They
not.
got into banking. They became they were big into ship navigation, maritime.
Hmm.
Um, they of course became a huge army. They were basically the army of the church. Uh,
Exactly.
a lot of their wealth was accumulated because noblemen and royalty believed that that their souls were at risk, and they felt like if
Yes.
they in later life joined the Templar order, and oftentimes that meant donating all of their lands and riches to the
Hmm.
Templars, that would be a way to curry favor with God. And so a lot of the noblemen of Europe did that, and so the Templars really just accumulated huge amounts of land and wealth. And as you said, they were the first sort of bankers in Europe. So they were only around for about 200 years, early 1100s to 1307 when they were outlawed. But during that 200-year period, 190-year period, whatever it was, they were incredibly powerful. But no
Yes.
one's really been able to explain what it was they found that made them so powerful. But
Do
everyone
you
would be
think that they were done away, you know, what is it, excommunicated, or they were accused of heresy? Do you think it was really because they had been heretical, or because, you know, too many people owed them money, and if you wipe out the banker, then you don't owe the money anymore?
exactly that. Yeah. So the
Okay.
King of France owed him a ton of money. And like you said, what better way to get rid of your debts than to kill your banker? So that was
Right.
definitely part of it. The church, I think, was eyeing them warily for a long time. And when the
Hmm.
King of France came along and said, "Hey, are you guys with me on this? I want to get rid of these guys," I think that the Vatican, the church at that point said, this is a good opportunity, because at some point, these guys, the secrets they have are going to come out, and it's going to turn ugly for us. And so this is
Right.
a good chance. We've got the whole French army is willing to do this. So yeah, let's go for it. So I think
Right,
it
and
was.
of course, I'm thinking they had to come up with something. they can't actually say, well, we're going to get rid of these guys because we owe them a lot of money. I guess then that's when you hear all these stories about all the things that they were accused of.
And I do think they were practicing a much different version of Christianity than what the church thought
Mm-hmm.
was orthodoxy. Again, just like the Cathars and the Albigensians. By the way, the Templars, most of them came from the same area of France as did the Cathars and the Albigensians. So
Really?
they
I didn't know that.
they probably had a sympathy towards the
Mm-hmm.
people who were wiped out during that crusade in the early 1200s. But so I think that whatever they learned did cause them to question Orthodox church teachings. And in fact, I think the most important thing they learned um, was this whole idea, and today we sort of recognize it as obvious, but duality, the importance of the yin and the yang, of the male and the female, of the light and the dark, of the
Mm-hmm.
as above, so below. This whole concept of balance and the need in a healthy organism to have balance. The church had turned incredibly patriarchal during that time
Oh,
period,
yes.
and it was unhealthy. It was unhealthy to be that male dominated a society. Women were really put down, and all the women aspects and attributes were put down, and it was an unhealthy situation. I think the Templars understood that and were pushing the church. One of the leaders in the let me put this the right way. The man who wrote the Templar Order was a guy by the name of Bernard de Clairvaux, who was later
Mm-hmm.
sainted in Saint Bernard. He was a Cistercian monk, but he wrote the order for the Templars. He was a very powerful figure in Christianity in the 12th century. In fact, he was asked to be pope a number of times, and he turned it down. But he spent a lot of his time pushing for the veneration of the Virgin Mary because he
Right.
understood how unhealthy it was to have just a male dominated church, and he wanted the female aspect to be elevated. So he used to talk
Sure.
about the fact that he had this dream. He would go on, he would lecture all over Europe about this dream that he had, that he was blind, and the only way to cure the blindness was for him to lactate at the breast of the Virgin Mary. And he told the story over and over again. And I'm not sure, and it gave him vision. Now, whether that's
Right.
vision, literal vision, or spiritual vision, okay, I'm not
Right.
sure. But there was a huge number of these paintings all through medieval Europe of Bernard de Clairvaux literally at the breast of the Virgin Mary, which
I
you,
never
if you look at
heard
these,
of
you think
that.
that's a shocking thing to
Yeah, I
see.
bet.
But during the medieval time period, this was a common motif, a common theme for painters to paint, was Bernard and lactating at the Virgin. Anyway, the point was Bernard, as sort of the patron of the Templars, he was out there pushing for the feminine, for the Virgin Mary. I think
Well,
the
because
Templars
this is,
are part of that.
and you also, people don't realize, like you said, people really believed it, like either if you were going to get excommunicated, or like you said, if they're getting older, that you wanted to, you could buy favors from the church, basically like clean my act up before I go into the hereafter, or even the pilgrims. I mean, I hate to say it, but there was a lot of things that were for sale with
Oh,
the
everything was
Catholic
for sale.
religion at that time. You could have been the worst possible person, and you could buy a favor, or you could buy and have some nuns or monks, pray for you, or do all these things to cleanse your soul, so that by the time you died, none of the bad stuff you did was going to matter. And
That
of
yeah, that
course,
was a big
there was always money involved, though. You had to pay
always
for that.
that was one of the big things with the Cathars and the Albigensian Crusade is the Cathars believed that you didn't need the priest as an interface between
And the
yourself and God. You could just pray to God directly. But
that's
without the
right there.
priest, there's nobody to take the money. And that the church is like, well, we can't have
Exactly.
that. We can't have you talking to God directly. We need to be the intermediary and have the collection plate, and you got to pay for all this.
Exactly.
So, like you said, it came down to the money.
The money, yes. Even the pilgrims that they had, the ways that all of that produced money
Sure.
ultimately for the church.
I always
And
say, follow the money. Follow the
yeah,
money.
that's usually, it's always held true across the board. So let me ask you, did the Templars ever evolve into something else?
So there's a lot of people who believe that they 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 went underground. Like, again, they were
Right,
outlawed in 1307, but just like when you outlaw the mafia, it doesn't mean they go away. It just means
right,
they go underground. So the Templars definitely didn't disappear. The prevailing wisdom is that they came back as the Freemasons.
right.
I've been doing some research recently that indicates it may have been an intervening step, that they may have come back first as a group called the Rosicrucians, and
Yes.
from the Rosicrucians came the Freemasons.
Right.
Either way, there's a lot of similarities between the the Templars and the Freemasons. I'm not a Freemason myself, but I do a lot of lecturing at Masonic lodges,
Right.
and it's funny because the younger guys, the guys who aren't all that uh, elevated in their advanced in their degree
Right.
work, they will say to me, "No, the Templars did not become the Freemasons." But the older guys, the 33rd degree guys, they'll sort of
Mm-hmm.
wink at me from the back and nod when I say stuff like that, because I think it's one of those things that's only revealed to the
When you're
Freemasons.
when you're you're up the and I've heard that a lot as far as the Freemasonry. When you're at the lower levels, there's only a certain amount of things that you really know. And it's not until I guess you've stuck around and you're a higher level Mason
Sure.
that you get
It was the same with the Templars. I think that when I talked about the Templars and their veneration of the Virgin Mary and the Sacred Feminine, the average Templar, knight on a horse out there fighting, they didn't know about that stuff. It was
right,
it was the guys at the very top who were sort of, in tune with all this, the idea of, again, the sacred feminine and all that. But it wasn't the foot soldiers who were doing this. It was the guys at the very top. So I think it's the same thing, as you said, in Freemasonry, where when you get to a certain level, it's probably true of every organization,
right.
when you get to a certain level, you're privy to secrets that at the lower level, you're just not. Probably
So what do you
happens
think
in,
they did with all their money? Because they had money. They had power. What do you think they did with all their money?
well, one of the reasons why the King of France, Philip le Bel, tried to outlaw them in 1307 was he wanted their wealth. He wanted to wipe
Right.
out his debts, but he also wanted their treasure. So on Friday the 13th of October, which is where the
Mhm.
Friday the 13th unlucky comes from, that's the day the French king raided the commandery in Paris, the Templar treasury,
Right.
and it was gone. The rumor has it that the couple days before, the Templars got word of what was going to happen, and they loaded up the stagecoaches with the treasures. And they went. If you picture a map of France, if you went north, you could then cross the English Channel to England and Scotland. If you went
Right.
south to Provence, you could then access the Mediterranean. What they
Sure.
did instead is they took the treasure due west to a port called La Rochelle, and from La Rochelle, the obvious place to go from there would be to America. There's really no reason to
Ah,
go
okay.
to La Rochelle if you're going to go either to the British Isles or to the Mediterranean. Like, it was a weird
Right,
thing.
because you always think of Calais as far as the nearest point to jump off, like you said, from France over to the UK. And if the Mediterranean, so this port says, okay, they weren't maybe going to either to anywhere in Europe, in other words.
Yeah, so maybe they went like to Iceland or something first.
Okay.
Um, maybe they did go to Scotland from there and came up around the other
Yes.
side. But it's weird that they chose La Rochelle. In any event, the treasures were never found. Most historians think if the treasure did disappear, it left out of La Rochelle and then either up to Scotland, perhaps eventually to America, perhaps to Iceland. Um,
Right.
that's the big mystery. What two mysteries? What was the treasure and where did it go? And that's what
Right.
I write about a lot. That's a lot of my books are based on that's sort of the carrot that is dangled in front of my characters. They're modern day characters. They're all looking for the Templar treasure, or at least the secrets of the Templars, as that's the historical mystery. But
Right.
everybody, I think, even older guys like me, we all remember the being 8 years old looking for the buried treasure in the backyard,
Course,
right?
of
That's
course.
we all
And
did.
that's the thing though. I,
So
I have to
unique.
laugh because I think once upon a time people thought, oh, if you find a treasure, buried treasure or something like that. Nowadays, from what I understand, you might find it, but you're not going to keep it because you'll have countries that will come and say, "Hey, sorry, buddy,
Yeah, yeah.
that's our treasure. That's our money from 1,000 years ago. Sorry."
You're very right about that. And people. One of the reasons why that TV show on History Channel, The Curse of Oak Island, is so
Yes,
popular. It's potentially the Templar treasure, some treasure buried up in Nova Scotia.
right.
That show's been going on for 9 or 10 years. I think I watch it every
Yeah,
week. I
yeah.
can't get enough of it, even though they never find anything. And I know that if they find something, the government has to be notified right away. And I'm going to read about
Exactly.
the newspaper months before I see it on TV. Like, there's no way they can show a TV show that is going to have a discovery of treasure that we don't know about already. It's just not the way
Exactly.
government works. And yet I still watch on the edge of my seat thinking maybe they're going to find it this week, even though intellectually I know that
Right.
impossible. I would have heard about it already. So, um,
Right. Yeah. That they actually found something. And again, sometimes I look at it and I go, why would they have made it so difficult to get their own treasure? I'm looking at that
yeah,
like, man,
yeah. But
it's like,
part of what they talk about on that island is that it's the Templar treasure, because a lot of things that they find on that island go back to the time of the Templars, the
right.
12th, 13th centuries. And when you think about it, there weren't a lot of Europeans who had the technological engineering abilities of the Templars, had the fleet of ships that the Templars
Right.
had. I think one of the things the Templars learned when they were in Europe, in the Middle East, pardon me, when they were in the Middle East, was they acquired navigational charts from the ancient Phoenicians, who were
Yes.
what we know today as the Lebanese, the modern Lebanese, and they were the
Right.
great navigators of the ancient world. And so they were right in the Middle East with the Templars. And I've always theorized that Templars would have acquired some of these navigational charts and skills from the Lebanese, the Phoenicians, and use
Have
those.
you heard of the theory that the Phoenicians did come over here to America, maybe around where the either through the Canada or at the mouth of the Mississippi and the Gulf. This I'm talking here BC,
Yeah, no,
right?
you and there's a whole other aspect to this, but yes, I think I've done a lot of research on that, and there's a lot of
Mhm.
evidence, a lot of artifacts that indicate there was Phoenician explorers in America, like you said, about 1,000 BC in that time frame,
Yes.
and what they in the Great Lakes region here in New England, and what they would have been doing if they were here is trading for and mining copper,
Yes.
because you needed copper to mix with tin. 92% copper, 8% tin, so a lot of copper. You needed that to make bronze during the Bronze Age, before the Iron
Yes.
Age. If you think about the gazillions of pounds of bronze, ornamentation, weaponry, utensils, all the stuff they use, bronze is everywhere, and there's just not enough copper in Europe and Africa, a lot of it, but not enough to supply all the bronze that was needed.
Yeah,
And
because they were
so
using it for various things. It was even for the soldiers, for breastplates. They had a
everything,
million uses for it.
bronze
And then,
was
of course,
every,
once the Iron Age came in, that was the end of that. But for the time it was in use, it was used for a lot of
and that
items.
would fit. That's why the Phoenicians would have come here, because the Great Lakes region has a ton of what's called float copper. And so
Mhm.
there's artifacts and so and that time frame works. So the Phoenicians would have come here in secret, got the
Yes.
bronze, traded for it, mined it, whatever, brought it back to Europe. On the way, probably stopped in England to get tin and Cornwall. We know they did that. And then that ended because at some point there was no longer such a big demand for bronze, because the Iron Age came in. And so there was no longer a need after,
Right.
say, 800 BC for the Phoenicians to keep coming back. And
Right.
so that's why that ended. But the Native Americans in the Great Lakes region talked about that when the pioneers first came out in the early 1800s, about how many generations ago the people who looked like you guys came over and took our copper. And there's
Right.
really strong evidence of these mines going back through.
And I'm thinking that even that they didn't mine it, that maybe the natives themselves are mining it for them. In other words, some type of, we're purchasing this, go and mine it for us. One of those deals.
Yeah, I think that's probably very likely. The Phoenicians were big traders. That's what they did in Cornwall in England. They traded for the tin. They weren't mining it themselves. They traded for it, and that's what the
I mean,
Phoenicians did.
do
So
you
yeah,
think, I know you write your stories are fictional, but it sounds like you've incorporated the Templars in your storyline. Is that correct? Or
right. So there's 17 books in this series. 16 or 17 books in the series. I'm on the
okay,
17th right now. It's called the Templars in America series, and so
okay,
um, it everything I write tends to have an underlying theme, two underlying themes. One is that the idea that there were waves of explorers in America before Columbus. And then
okay,
secondly, the whole idea of the Templars discovered something secret, a treasure of some kind, when they were in Jerusalem. And what was that treasure? And then was that treasure the thing that got them outlawed? And then a subset of that, as you asked before, is the Templars, they became the Freemasons. And what do the
Right.
Freemasons know today about all of this? And are there clues in Freemasonic ritual and traditions that we can start to put some of these pieces together? By studying the Freemasons and what they do today, can we learn about the Templar secrets from 600 or 700 years ago?
Right.
And so those are sort of the themes in my book. In my books, they're all set in modern days, but they all turn on these mysteries, and they all
Right.
involve the artifacts and sites here in America, artwork, whatever. But the idea is there's something that happened back then that we don't know about
Exactly.
today, and we're trying to figure it out.
Let me ask you, is there any part of your storylines where part of the, whether you want to say the Templar belief, there was, I don't want to say use the word supernatural, but that whether there was the belief system or the practices or something, that there was something mystical about it?
So mysticism, yes. Supernatural, probably no. So when we talk about
Right.
mysticism, the Templars had a fascinating, and this goes back again to Bernard de Clairvaux,
Right.
the Cistercian monk in the 12th century, had a fascinating, close relationship with the mystical Jewish sects of France who were studying Kabbalah and Kabbalism, this whole
Mhm.
mystical uh, um, um, offshoot of Judaism, not offshoot, but area of Judaism. And so mysticism was very important to them, Kabbalism. So in that sense, yes. And in that sense, the Templars and the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians between them are part of this whole continuum of secret societies, mystery schools that have been interested in things like in alchemy, because they're interested in things like the Philosopher's Stone and the Fountain of Youth and the idea of turning uh, heavy metals into gold and that whole thing going back to the ancient Egyptians. So that aspect of the Freemasons and of the Templars is also part, I think, of what's going on here. And that's also something that goes back thousands of years and is part of the human condition. This idea we're looking for treasure, but we're also looking for the fountain of youth. Maybe that's the holy grail.
Right, and people don't realize that, you might think, "Oh, the fountain of youth," but there was a belief, really, truly, that that existed, as in trying to
Very
find it.
much, especially during medieval times, and even as late as World War II. Hitler was convinced that the Templar treasure, if he could find it, that he could weaponize it, that it would give him these
Right.
mystical
I
powers. He
wanna
called
show
the arma,
the,
the power of God. If he could find if he could find the spear of destiny, if he could
here's
find
some of
Moses'
your book
staff.
covers.
There we go. Thank you. He was convinced that some, artwork, some medieval artwork, was a secret map to the Templar treasure, and so Hitler was all over that. But the idea that you could use some of this stuff to be weaponized, or in Hitler's case, the Fountain of Youth. The idea that obviously, no amount of money is too much if you can have eternal life, and so
Right,
that
exactly, yeah,
was
like, yeah, once you get all that money, but then you die, of course, that obviously, that quest for immortality,
right. Yeah.
that
So
definitely
I think if the book that's on the second row down is called Treasure Templari. Can you put that back up?
Sure, there
Can
you
you
go.
raise? Can you scroll down a little bit to
Yep,
the
yep, I'm gonna do that right now.
second row?
Yeah, that one right
There you
there,
go. Yeah, the black one,
Treasure
Treasure Templari.
Templari.
Yeah, and that book is based on the idea that Hitler was trying to use a medieval artwork called the Ghent altarpiece to
Mhm.
find the Templar treasure. So um, that's the one we were just talking about. But there, you can see
Okay.
they're all based on Templarism in
Right,
some.
right, like, in other words, you do the research, and the storyline is fiction, but you're basing it on true either events or items or whatever the case might
Right.
be.
The cover next to Treasure Templari with the tower with the sunlight coming through.
Yes,
That's
right.
something called the Newport Tower in Newport, Rhode Island, and that's one of the most important artifacts. if you go there today, it's on the highest hill in Newport. I think we might have a picture of the tower itself, don't we?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
So if
we
you go
do.
there
Hold
today,
on.
you'll see a historical marker that talks about how it was a medieval, it was a colonial windmill built by Governor Benedict Arnold in the 1670s. There it is. That he said this was a windmill. Governor Benedict Arnold was the great grandfather of the trader Benedict Arnold, and that
I
this
was about to
supposedly
say,
was
any relation?
yeah, great grandfather. This is supposedly a windmill, but anybody who has a background in engineering will laugh at
Right.
that and say there's no way that you would build a windmill on 8 pillars because the lateral forces of the wind would cause that tower to crumble. That tower is very strong if you're putting weight at the top. So a vertical weight, it would be very strong. But any kind of lateral forces, and so the idea that that was built as a windmill sort of makes no sense. The more the research is done on that tower, the more it looks like it was probably built by our group of Scottish explorers with the Templar roots back around 1400, Prince Henry Sinclair. And we'll get too deep into that tower, but there's a lot of evidence that that tower it was part of what I'm talking about earlier, which is the 1398 journey by Scottish explorers.
So let me ask you, do they have an exact date or have they dated it to when it was built?
So one of the things that the group I belong to, New England Antiquities Research Association, we did some work on that tower about 10 years ago. Back in the day, when you used mortar to build something like that, you used seashells to make the mortar because of the lime content. And
Right.
when the town was repairing the walkway around that tower, we found a piece of mortar that had fallen off, and attached to that mortar was a seashell. And so we took that seashell to Woods Hole Oceanographic Society to get it carbon dated, and the carbon dating came back at 1430 plus or minus 20. Don't quote me exactly
Really?
on that, but early 1400s, which indicates again that that mortar goes back to the early 1400s. So to me, that's probably the time of construction, or maybe it was constructed even earlier, and that was a repair. But the tower was standing at that time. That's otherwise you wouldn't need mortar. So that kind of evidence. Recently, we approached the city of Newport about going in there and doing something called optically stimulated luminescence testing. One of our members died and gave us a big grant to go in there to do some scientific testing, and we'd go underneath the pillars and extract
Okay.
um, uh, sediment and whatever, and test the sediment to see how long it had been in that. When was the last time it had been exposed to sunlight?
Right.
And that would basically be the date of construction. And the city's reaction was, well, we already know, it was built in 1677, so why do we need to do that? And it's just very frustrating because we don't know that. I mean, that's the theory, but oftentimes historians are wrong. And if we did the scientific testing and it came back 1677, okay. But there's a
Right.
lot of evidence that takes it back much earlier than that. And this was a chance to very unobtrusively go in there and get some real science behind this.
What was that being used for? As a watchtower kind of thing, or
Yeah, so exactly. So probably multiple uses, because if you're going to build something like that, you might as
right?
well make a lot of uses. But on the second floor, there's a fireplace, which is another reason why it makes no sense as a windmill, because you would never have an open flame where
Sure.
you're roasting flour, because kaboom. And probably some of those windows you see, they look out over the harbor, and probably it was almost like a lighthouse on the
Like
highest
a
hill.
lookout thing.
Lookout and a lighthouse, sort of a guide.
Yeah.
Also, probably used as some kind of religious structure, a baptistry of some kind. There's evidence that in addition to the tower, there was a wooden ambulatory around it. We found
Uh-huh.
evidence of post holes, and there may even have been a chancel that extended out. So it may be that that's all that's left, but there were wooden aspects of it around it. But it was very similar design to other Templar churches. The Templar churches were almost always round, just like that, often with 8 pillars, 8 arches like that. So there's a lot about that screams Templars,
The
and also a lot
design
about it
is
that it's Romanesque. It's like you don't find that kind of architecture in colonial America. I mean, it's just
no,
so out of
no,
place.
it's no, you don't. You don't.
So out of
Not at
place. So
all.
yeah.
No,
Anyway, so
you
it's
don't.
because we really want to get some more science behind this, and the city basically said, "Well, thanks, but no thanks."
That's unusual. You would think they would say, "Okay, you're paying for it. Go right ahead." You know?
There are people who have sort of gone on the record with a certain position. It was Governor Benedict Arnold,
Oh,
1675,
I know where you're
1677,
going with
and
this.
they don't want egg on their face. So like, it's easier for
Exactly.
them to say no. And
Yeah, like, "Hey, we've been saying this, and that'll make me look like a dumbass."
ex- exactly, exactly.
Yeah,
So
and their egos get in the way, in other words.
yep. So that's just one of the artifacts that we found that
Right.
seemed to indicate something was going on right around 1400 here in New England, and it wasn't, it wasn't the Indians, and they didn't build that.
Let me
So
ask you, you had sent me, I don't know, you had sent me a picture of something called the Inhoque Stone. Is
right,
that close?
so yeah, this tower we're looking at now is on the highest point in Newport, Rhode Island, and about a mile away on the shoreline, which is where the Templars would have landed had they come in
Right,
the harbor. There is this stone, and in Latin it says "In hoc signo vinces." Under this battle, under this banner, we are victorious. It's an old Templar battle cry, and that boulder that you see there was exposed after a huge storm, Hurricane Irene, about 10, 12
really?
years ago. But otherwise it's covered, and hadn't been uncovered for a long time prior to that. But that may be evidence that maybe something the Templars carved when they first arrived,
Right.
1398, 1400, whatever it was, carved that, and then they worked their way up the hill to build the tower. Maybe they built the tower first and then carved that. I don't know, but it seems to be it's a Templar battle cry in a spot where
What
it's
Templars
been.
aren't supposedly were
Yeah,
at.
exactly. So it's Roman. It's I'm sorry, it's Latin, but it is a Templar battle cry, and so it raises an eyebrow. It's again another. It's consistent with the idea that the Templars were there and built a tower right around the year 1400.
That is so interesting. And you, it makes you think that every time you have these storms, they basically bring up things that maybe have been hidden for a long time.
Right.
All right. You know, as far as, but sometimes people say, well, why isn't there more proof of that they were here? Sometimes it's there, it's just that it's buried.
It's buried, or one of the things people ask me, how come this is just coming out now, in the last
Mm-hmm.
15 or 20 years? So the big part of that is the internet. We didn't have the internet, a
Yes.
generation ago. And a huge part of this is the ability for me living in Westford, Massachusetts, and studying the Westford night carving. Maybe do we have a picture of the Westford night, the pink
I'll tell you right.
image of.
Yes, yes, yes. Hold on.
So
Here we go.
this is the story is when Prince Henry Sinclair and his group came over to Westford in 1398. They came up, and Westford has the highest hill in northeastern Massachusetts. Native American guides. One of Sinclair's men died. His name was Sir James Gunn, and
Okay.
to commemorate his death, to memorialize his death, they carved an effigy in the rock ledge of
Really?
Gunn with his sword, and you can see that's a rubbing of this effigy carved into the rock ledge. So, and that's clearly a medieval battle sword going down
Oh
the
yeah,
front.
no, no, no. That definitely is. That
Yeah.
there's no.
So I started studying this, and 30, 40 years ago, I would not have been able to share that image with other researchers in other parts of the country or in Europe
Okay.
who could help me identify it, or who could say, we've got something that's a lot like that here in Rhode Island, or up in here in Maine, or here in Vermont, that we can't understand and we can't explain either. But maybe we all have separate puzzle pieces to one big puzzle.
Yes.
And until the internet came along, it was really hard to share those puzzle pieces and
Mm-hmm.
communicate. And then all of a sudden it became really easy. And then all of a sudden we start saying, wow, there are like 12, 15 puzzle pieces. And we're starting to see
Exactly.
a picture develop here. And so that's what I think allowed this research really to take off starting in, I don't know, 2000
I mean,
ish.
that's very obviously a knight, the sword, the shield, everything. That's
Yeah, and look, to be honest, if you go there today, you can still very clearly see the sword, but the knight, the head and the shield part,
mm-hmm.
a lot of that's been eroded away, weathered away, because it's on a main road, and you got the ice melt and the
Mm-hmm.
rock salt and the acid rain and everything. So the sword is still visible. It's a medieval sword for certain. The rest of it is faded away. Um, we're trying to preserve it as best we can, but in any event, even the sword itself is important, because again, it's a medieval sword. It's a hand and a half. It's not a colonial era dagger or something. It's called a claymore, that particular sword. So,
Right. It looks
yeah,
like a
but
very tall sword.
yep, yeah, it's a battle sword. Again, Mel Gibson and Braveheart. We talked about him earlier, so that's what you would
Exactly.
use it. Yeah. So
Exactly.
you've got the sword, you've got the Inhoque stone, you've got this Newport Tower. There's other runic inscriptions. Runic is a language spoken in Scandinavia during that time period. And I mentioned earlier Prince Henry Sinclair, although he was Scottish, his
Right.
wife, his mother was Scandinavian, and probably a large number of the members of his crew were Scandinavian because they were really
You
skilled.
have here something called the Spirit Pond Runestone.
Perfect. Yeah, show that one. Yeah. So this was found up in Maine in the 1970s. It's up along the coast, on a pond near the coast of near Bath, Maine. It was discovered by just a gentleman out looking for arrowheads or something. But it's a
Wow.
ship log. It talks about how they mended nets and they fished and they sailed, but it has a date in it, 1401. So that's a great date.
Wow.
And then nearby, they found the remains of a sod house, and the University of Maine archaeological team carbon dated the sod house at 1406 plus or minus 5. So this is right in the time frame of our 1398, 1400 Prince Henry Sinclair, Newport Tower, up and down the coast. And again, there's no other explanation for that. But that's another artifact that sort of tells the same story, that something's going on,
Right.
runic inscription, the date's right on there, right along the coastline, up and down the New England coast. In and of itself, hard to explain. When you start putting it together with the other pieces of the puzzle, now it starts to tell a picture.
Right, because the thing is that I'm thinking is, you think of all these discoveries of the time period of Columbus. Really, what they were trying to do is reach Asia, India for trading. These earlier explorers, I don't think they were trying to find India or the Far East.
No.
They just sailed and came across whatever it was and finds, hey,
Yeah, and
this is
I think
interesting.
Columbus. So there's lots of evidence about Columbus. I don't know if we can get into this a little bit. He
Sure.
married into he married the let me get this right. Uh, his father-in-law was a grand master of something called the Knights of Christ. That's one of the organizations that the Templars folded themselves into after they were outlawed. So the Templars became the Knights of Christ in Portugal.
Okay.
Columbus married into the Perestrello family, and Perestrello himself was a grand master of the Knights of Christ. And part of his
Wow.
dowry was his father-in-law gave him all of his maps and charts,
Wow.
presumably including all the Templar maps and charts. So Columbus probably had maps and charts going back to the Templar time period, which showed how to get across. He also, at that time, someone else married into that same family, which was the grandson of Prince Henry Sinclair, our guy who came over
Oh, okay.
together on a small island in the Azores. So Columbus had his father-in-law and also his brother-in-law, whatever what you would call that. That they married sisters, who
Right.
also probably had charts from the Scottish side of things. So I think Columbus knew what was going on over here. I think the reason he sailed so far south is he knew that in New England, in that area, you were going to hit America. I
Right.
think he was trying to skirt south to get underneath America and get all the way to Asia. I think that's what was going on with him.
Well,
Just
the
guessing.
thing is that people don't realize the only way he was going to be able to keep sailing was that he brought something worth because they were financing these trips out there, the
Right.
king and the queen of Spain. And it was always with the hopes you're going to make it worth our while, right? That we're paying for your ships and your food and your crew. So he
Yeah.
knew
Again, we
that to
talked
keep
about
on
earlier.
sailing,
Follow the money. It's
he had to bring something back that would allow him to come back again.
well, and he did, and the Spaniards took a boatload of gold, many boatloads of
Yes.
gold
Oh,
out of
yes.
Central America. So, from an
Oh, yeah.
economic point of view, the Spaniards did very well by coming to America. Columbus, I think, it's hard to tell. I mean, I think Columbus knew about the earlier Templar journeys. I think he was a little bit, part of that. Um,
Hmm.
but I think he sort of lost his way at one point because some of the
I
things
don't
he
think that
did.
the motive was exploration for the sake of exploration. It was always, like you said, the money.
Yeah,
something's going to come. Either we're going to reach the Far East without having to go over land or whatever,
right.
or maybe come. But in other words, it wasn't just we're going to explore for the sake of finding out what's there. It was
No, I don't
always
think
with.
that was it. No, I think it was too dangerous for that, and
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you.
No, they and of course that's I did not know that what you just said about what family he married into. That's
Yeah,
very
Pellicer
interesting.
family, and they were living on the island of Madeira. I don't want to say that because I might be wrong. A small island that his father-in-law discovered, and so Columbus was like stuck on this island with his father-in-law and all his maps and charts, and then also a guy named Drummond who descended from Prince Henry Sinclair. So it was all around him, this Templar map chart history stuff. He had to have had access to it.
Let me ask you, you also sent over the Westford boat stone. What is that?
Yeah, so the story again was that Sinclair and his group came up. Um, they climbed the hill in Westford. One of the guys died. They carved the Westford Knight carving, which we
Right.
saw earlier. Then the group went back down the hill, continued up something called the Stony Brook, a little brook that came in off the Merrimack River, which is the Merrimack is the way they came in from the Atlantic Ocean to the Westford area. From the Merrimack to the Stony Brook. From the Stony Brook, they climbed the big hill, come back down the hill, continue a little further up to Stony Brook, and they made their winter encampment spot. And this is where we find this stone right here at the encampment site. And what we think those are, there's clearly a medieval boat on the upper left. And again, just
Right.
like
Yeah, yeah, that's what I'm saying. And
yeah, that's a medieval boat. It's not a colonial era boat. Just like the sword is not a colonial sword, it's a medieval sword. I had a law
mm-hmm.
professor who used to say to me, look, common sense is the most important thing, most important tool in your chest. And if you're going to find carvings of things on rocks, they're probably going to be contemporaneous with things that the carver knows about. They're not going to, you're not going to have a colonial carver carving items that are no longer in his experience, his worldview, right?
Exactly.
They didn't have encyclopedias back then. So when we start seeing medieval swords and medieval ships and medieval crossbow arrows, which is what's on the right there, it's
Uh-huh.
probably carved by a medievalist. Okay. It's also the
Sure.
number 184 at the bottom there. We're not quite sure what that means. Possibly 184 paces in the direction of that arrow.
Okay.
There were some remains. We've done that, and there were remains. Look like the remains of some kind of stone structure. So there's possibilities that that's the encampment site. But the important
Okay.
thing about that stone is that we were able to send that to a laboratory in Minnesota to a geologist who studies these kinds of things. And by comparing the weathering of the carved areas to the
Mm-hmm.
weathering of the uncarved areas of the stone, sides of the
Right.
stone, he can determine how long the stone was in a weathering environment. How long have those carved areas been exposed to freezing and thawing and wind and cold and
Right.
everything? And he determined that the weathering indicated that stone had been outside for about 600 years. And that brings us right back
Okay.
to that's a great time
Yeah.
period. That brings us back to 1400. Right
1400
back where we
exactly.
want to it. So that's an important piece of science. The other thing about that stone, it was carved, pecked really, the same technique as the Westford Knight carving. So we associate those two stones. They're about a mile apart, and they were carved with looks like the same tool and same hand.
Okay.
And if one is 600 years old, the other one is also probably 600 years old. And so again, we've got some good science behind this legend and evidence. It always comes back to evidence for me.
Sure.
So we started to look at all these different things, the Newport Tower with the dating and the runestone that says 1401, and the scientist tells us 600 years ago, and all that stuff. It's all clustered right back at 1400. It all seems to be related, and it all seems to be in that.
Right, because from what you're saying is, yeah, you look at the commonality. What's the like you said, more than likely, yeah, they're all from that same time period, give or take a few years.
Right. So so maybe I have the story wrong, but you can't just ignore those artifacts. You can't ignore the evidence to say, well, you know, we don't know. Like, tell me another story if you want that takes into account all the evidence we have. Maybe it was Chinese explorers. I don't know, but you
Mm-hmm.
got to tell a story. There's something happened. We have these artifacts, and we need to figure out some kind of, we call it a case theory in law school. What's the case theory? How do we tell a story that incorporates all this? And maybe we get the story wrong. Hopefully not, but there is a story. So
Right.
you can't just ignore it and say, well,
Well, for the way I look at it, for those people that are into the treasures, because Columbus, like I said, really the aim of it was we're exploring, but to get money, to find goods, gold, whatever. Maybe the ones that arrived here, they were the opposite. They were trying to drop off treasure. They were just trying to
that's
find
exactly, they were trying to hide their treasure. Yep,
right.
I
They had
think
a
you're
safe place where nobody is around here to ever, there's no spies. It's not Europe. Because let's face it, even in Scotland, you're basically very close to Europe.
right.
There was
Well,
always somebody that could rat you
at
out.
any time in Scotland, the English can come up and invade. It
Yeah,
goes back and
exactly.
forth for hundreds of years. And so at that particular time, sure, Robert the Bruce is in charge and we're safe, but that can change
Exactly.
in a matter of months.
Sure.
And so, and for whatever reason, it seems like the Templars were able to forge a really close relationship with the Native Americans. And so
Sure.
there's a lot of, no, I won't say there's a lot. There are some historians who believe that the Templar treasure is still here in America, maybe
Right.
even Montana, I've heard that it's still being hidden, that no, we still haven't found it, maybe.
And you always
Um,
think also if you have a treasure, it's like everything, like don't put all your money in one bank. Maybe they split it up into more than one location as far as,
yep,
somebody discovers one portion, they're not going to be able to take all of it. We're
right.
going
And that's
to.
why Oak Island is potentially one of those spots. So
Mm-hmm.
I think you're right. I think that would just be common sense again to don't put all your eggs in one basket, as you said.
Oh, if they've gone through all the trouble and they've crossed, so you would think, no, we're going to make sure that if anybody ever comes out here and they find one, they're not going to find everything. And then what happens is sometimes I wonder, how time goes by that things are forgotten. Um, like about a year ago in Spain, they were doing this. Basically, they found one of these Roman era villas around the same, right around 100 AD, and under a portico, basically the actual villa, but they found like an outbuilding, and
Oh,
there's
yeah,
the
I saw that
frame
story. Yeah,
of
yeah,
the house, and they found like 200 of these jugs full of coins. Okay,
yeah,
and obviously, what happens is whoever put him there, either I'm not gonna say forgot. I think like you said, you never know. Somebody could die. He could be going down the road, get run over, and he's the
yeah.
person that knew.
That reminds me of the story, in Jerusalem where the first temple was. I'm sorry, Herod's temple, not the first one. The
Right,
Herod's temple was destroyed, and the rumors are that the treasure was hidden around Jerusalem for recovery later on. But the people who hid it were all killed, and so there's
right,
like no
exactly.
one knows. There are some Dead Sea Scrolls that list all the different treasure that was hidden, and it's very colloquial. By the washroom, under the steps of the washroom, but people today don't know where the washroom was back then, right? But that's what
Right,
it would
yeah,
say.
the
And
point
so
of reference.
so somewhere under some stairs, under some washroom, back 2,000 years ago, there's a treasure. But like, try to find it today. But back then,
Yeah,
the people were killed by the Romans, and the secret died with them. So
right. And they were saying, well, why would anybody put away all these gold coins? Because in those time periods, the coins would be marked with whoever the emperor was. They would basically put their faces on these coins. They were saying that around the time that they think that this was put away, there was like high inflation. So if you ever want to buy something, you needed gold coins. In other words, to make purchases of this nature. In other words,
sure.
why would anybody hoard it that way? But obviously they forgot about it. Well, I'm not going to say that's the theory of forgetting about it doesn't make sense. It's more like whoever knew about it maybe died
They were wiped out. Again,
unexpectedly.
this is wartime. So you hide your stuff, and you
Yeah.
tell your wife about it, and hopefully you tell your kids. But if everyone gets wiped out, it's gone.
Well, they say that this was like an outhouse, I guess the equivalent in a Roman villa of the barn where they kept the animals and stuff.
Yeah.
And it was under the main entrance where there was structure to hold the doors, and they buried it like right there. And again, This is not the kind of stuff somebody's going to forget about, you know, or again, and I'm going to say not all the time, but a lot of times it was word of mouth. In other words, people would be afraid to write that stuff down.
Well, and
So you pass,
people were illiterate back then. They couldn't
yes,
write. Most people couldn't write back then.
yes,
Even the
yes.
noblemen couldn't write. Only the clergy had the ability to write, even up through medieval times.
Right. This is, as a matter of fact, that's what people don't down the road. Also, this is what caused the schism, with the Protestantism, with the Catholic Church, was that besides the literacy, everything was written in Latin. Like you said, these monasteries were the ones that had the books. I mean, in a way, they kind of help conserve knowledge, especially after you had the plague go through Europe. But your regular person walking around, besides not being able to read, let's face it, they didn't understand Latin or
No,
read Latin or
yeah,
anything like that.
yeah. It was just recently
So,
that the church stopped using Latin in our
right.
lifetime, and it was
Yeah,
a big deal because a lot
right.
of people today still prefer the Latin mass. Yeah,
No, yeah. I mean, the thing is that if you have a choice that's different, if you want to hear the mass in Latin, by all means. But when we're talking to a regular person, let's face it, not every, most people don't know Latin. You know,
no, no.
like quid pro quo or caveat emptor. That's about as good as I know.
Yeah, we got a little bit of it in law school, a little bit, but yeah, not enough.
But
Just enough.
that's about it.
Yeah.
And yeah, that what's that saying? Knowledge is power.
Um, yeah, and that's a big part of one of the reasons why the church didn't want people to
No.
understand what was being said in those
Yes.
masses, or to be more importantly to be able to read. And this, again, going back to the Templars, when the Templars came back from the Middle East, they came back to Europe. Europe was
Hmm.
just coming out of the Dark Ages, or trying to come out of the Dark Ages, and the Templars came back with all this new knowledge, science, and medicine, and the ability to build these incredible cathedrals. The church was okay with that part, but the church did not want science and medicine. They didn't want people to be healed by healers. They wanted people to
A
pay the
miracle.
priests to pray for
Yes.
them to heal. We talked about that already. So all the stuff that the Templars were doing was, on the one hand, was helping society, but the church didn't want it. The church didn't want
No.
this all these newfangled ideas, right?
Sure. Well, and,
The
and
idea
this
that
is the thing.
the world was round and you could sail across the Atlantic. They didn't
Yeah, and
necessarily want.
you're not going to fall off the earth, and the sea serpents aren't going to get you. But you know what? Shock and awe has always been part of like most religions, because even BC, where we're talking ancient civilizations, they've gone in and found artifacts in some of these temples where they would have, let's say, the statue of whatever it was. And they would make it in such a way that they could put something in there to make like smoke come out of the nostrils of the
Right.
statue. In other words, there's always been this element of like, wow, you got to like basically present something to
Sure.
the regular people so that they'll follow you and come and give money at the temple, whatever.
Yeah.
So I think that they were following in that tradition, that unless there was some.
There's a very we talked about the Phoenicians earlier. There's a very cool site up in southern New Hampshire called America's Stonehenge. It used to be called Mystery Hill, and
Uh-huh.
one of the leading theories about that site, it was built by the Phoenicians when they came across the Atlantic. They landed here in Massachusetts and used that
Hmm.
spot in New Hampshire as sort of a base camp as they went across to the Great Lakes to get copper.
Right.
That site has a ceremonial central area to it, and in the middle of that is a slab that's called the sacrificial table. It looks like where they sacrificed animals, and
Yeah.
you can see where the blood would pool up and stuff. Underneath the table, there's a hidden chamber where the
Okay.
priest would hide, and as the sacrifice was taking place, the priest would speak out as if it was the god
There you go.
talking
Yeah.
to the people from underneath, almost like the animal was talking that was being sacrificed, and the priest would project his voice out in a hidden spot
There
underneath.
you go.
Like you said, shock and awe. You need to put on the show as
Yeah.
to the
All
to
the
the.
normies are going, huh, whoa, you know, yeah, yeah, because
Yeah.
people don't realize a lot of these temples, they were maintained by the people giving, offerings or leaving stuff there,
Oh yeah,
that kind of deal.
totally.
You wanted the
Totally.
gods to favor you, you had to like, there's always been like, if not the money, the goods, whatever you want to whatever you want to call it. I'm going to ask you just I know this is definitely it's just something I was reading up on lately, which was weird. I don't know if you've ever heard it. This was about the missing a Roman the missing ninth or the ninth legion that had gone, that they were saying that it was being used like before 100 BC to like maybe 100 AD by the Romans, as you know,
So
they
yeah, I wrote a whole book about it. Can you flip my
oh,
books back up again?
oh, sure. Hold on. Wait,
Yeah.
wait, wait.
So I wrote a book called Romerica,
Oh
and
my
it's
God.
based,
Wait, let me
yeah,
find it. Hold on.
it's based on what you just talked about. A little bit what I talked about earlier about how the treasure from the temple in Jerusalem disappeared, and it
Okay.
disappeared around the same time as the Ninth Roman Legion disappeared, and it
Okay.
also is about the same time we find all these coins, Roman coins, have washed ashore in New England, and they all seem to be dated in the 2nd century, right around the same time as the Ninth Legion and the what's called the Bar Kokhba uprising in Jerusalem, which is really when the temple was finally
Right.
destroyed.
That's I understand they can't make up their mind. Hold on. Let me they can't make up their mind exactly where exactly did this ninth legion go missing, kind of deal.
Yeah, and so one of a fellow researcher wrote a book about 10, 15 years ago, Rick Osman, that his
Mm-hmm.
theory is that the Ninth Legion ended up here in America. Let's see,
Right.
let's go down. It's the second row, far left.
Okay, Romerica, right there. The
Yeah,
Roman
there we go.
artifact in
America, far
America.
left.
Yep.
Yeah, Roman artifacts in America. And so that whole book, actually one of the few that actually doesn't really relate too much to the Templars, but that dates
Mm-hmm.
to all these Roman coins. Um, Most sparked by in 2016 we had a storm up here in Newburyport, and
Okay.
a couple went out metal detecting and found about 2 dozen second
Oh,
century Roman coins had washed ashore. Like, where did they come from?
wow.
But that's probably the 8th or 9th time we've had in coastal Massachusetts we've had Roman coins washed ashore. So where are they all coming from? One of the
Uh-huh.
possibilities is at one point a Roman ship got blown off course and ended up here in America, and then they kept coming back and forth. Again, trade
Sure.
opportunities.
Of
Um,
course.
Lots of Roman artifacts also in the Ohio River Valley. And so one of the possibilities is that at some point, for some reason, they ended up in the Ohio River Valley, the Roman Ninth Legion, perhaps. Again, a
Okay.
gentleman wrote a book about the Ninth Legion he thinks was found in and around Indiana in the Ohio River Valley. But that whole book,
Really?
Romero, is based on the Ninth Legion disappearing, the treasure of the temple treasure disappearing, and all these
Uh-huh.
coins and other artifacts. They're all clustered right around that same time period. So
Really?
it's a
That is
theory.
so
I can't
interesting.
prove it, but you mentioned the Ninth Legion, and I've heard very
Yes.
few people talk about that. You're one of the few people I've ever heard mention that. But it just so
Yeah.
happened that I use that to trigger my Romerica novel.
Right, because they can't, they say, well, that Sutcliffe lady in 19, what was it, 1954, she wrote that book, which was fiction, but they had just discovered in one of these well, no, actually they hadn't just discovered, it was like 1865 in one of these digs, these archaeological digs over in, was it Silchester or something like that? They had dug up an eagle, all right? And it was missing the wings, and it was hollow, and they were thinking that it was part of maybe of a statue of Jupiter.
Mhm.
She used that discovery. She wrote that book about the Ninth Legion, like in 1954. It was totally, and that's where what basically sparked the interest for people to figure out. In her book, she made it like that they were basically decimated by, when they went up against the Picts and the Celts,
Yep.
in
Yep.
Scotland, that they were wiped out. And supposedly these were like top tier military this legion, the ninth, they were like one of the best as far as a fighting force. And then there's another one that say that no, that maybe that they were out in Europe somewhere
Well,
when they got
right. So the two theories I've heard, one is they got wiped out by the Picts, but there's also some strong evidence that they ended up being redeployed to help put down the Jewish uprising in the year
right in
130
Judea.
in
Exactly.
Jerusalem. and that ties to the missing treasure, the Temple of Solomon treasure. The Ninth Legion disappeared, and the treasure disappeared, and then all this stuff ended up in America at the same time.
Wouldn't
All this,
that be interesting?
so all this Roman stuff. So you got a
Do you
Roman
think
knight.
that maybe that it was accidental, or do you think that they were sent it? Well, no, it's yeah, that they're.
I think they got deployed to Jerusalem, and I think
Mm-hmm.
they, as the war was winding down, and prisoners were begging and trading for their lives. We
Right.
talked about how people forgot where the treasure was, but maybe instead of being killed, somebody said, "If you let me live, I'll show you the treasure." And maybe
Right.
they were killed anyway, but it's somehow the Ninth Legion was able to find the treasure. And now you got a bunch of guys in the Legion who've got this treasure and say, should we give it to the Emperor, or should we take it and get the heck out of Dodge? And we
Right.
know about, because they've been stationed in England, they knew potentially about crossing the Atlantic. Let's go across the Atlantic. We've got the ships, we've got the treasure. Let's lay low for 10 or 20 years, and then we'll
Yes.
come back. Maybe we'll come back to,
Or maybe they just wanted to retire. I mean, let's face it.
and maybe some of them just stayed. But we have this whole cluster of Roman era artifacts in the Ohio River Valley, and a
That
belief
is.
that the Ninth Legion ended up there. And anyway, so there's a lot of stuff that Romerica, even though that doesn't really tie into the Templars, it's one of the most interesting books I think I've written. And if you're interested
I
in
had
the Ninth
never heard of
Legion,
that.
if you're going to read one of them, I would say grab that one. That would be a really fun one if you have an interest in that. But that's a kind of thing. All these different little pieces, these clues, I try to tie them together in a modern day thrill ride, roller coaster ride, but also a ton of history. All the history that gets rolled
Right.
into that. Even though it's fiction, my readers often call me up and say, it's not really fiction, it's more like faction. A lot of them say.
Right. That there's a layer of fact, and then of course maybe the characters are fictional, and
Exactly.
things like that.
Exactly.
But
It's modern day
which,
stuff, but it's ancient mysteries.
yes. Which, as far as fiction, that's my favorite type of fiction, unless you're going fantasy, which everything is made up. But yeah, I love the fiction that is surrounded by truth, so it's much more believable.
Yeah, that's
When
exactly,
you.
yeah. That's the formula for me.
Oh, absolutely.
Truth-based fiction, historical-based fiction. I actually include pictures in the book of the Newport Tower, of the In Hawkstone, the rune stones, all that stuff, so that when you're reading the book, you know that even though the story is fiction, the artifacts that I'm talking about
Right.
are real. That these are real artifacts, and you can actually see them in the pages, which I think a lot of readers really appreciate, because you don't have to wonder. When I read the Da Vinci Code, it's like, well, I'd love to see the painting he's talking about. So
Right.
I just said, what the heck? It's fiction, but no one says I can't put pictures in, even though you don't see it very often in fiction. I'm like, let's
Uh-huh.
do it. If we're talking about artifacts, I'd rather have readers not wonder whether those artifacts are real or not.
Right. Or
There's
did
no
you just
better way
come
to
up with
feel.
this great idea of like, let me throw a relic in here?
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
and that's the thing. A lot of people don't realize these Romans were really superstitious, you know,
I didn't know that.
as amulets and talismans. And
Oh, that's, yeah.
recently they just discovered same thing out in a dig in Britain somewhere. I can't remember exactly where. They found basically it was like a medal that they would give to soldiers, to the military, and they would use it like on parade, and it had the head of the Medusa, and everybody thinks of the Medusa as the Greek, she turns you to stone.
Right.
But by the time the Romans come around, basically they were using the Medusa to repel evil.
Oh,
All right.
cool.
Okay. And they just discovered it. Yeah, that basically they would just wear it, and this was a military thing. So because they still come up on the these old British excavations, fortresses that they had out in
Yeah.
Britain.
Tons of them, yeah.
But yeah, they you know what? I was reading through some of these things. These people, these soldiers, basically the best that they could expect as they aged out is that they would get basically like a small pension and allowed to retire.
Well,
But most of them spent their
they
lives fighting.
or they find the temple treasure,
Or
and
yeah, there you go.
they go west. So
Hey, you know what? I'm done with the fighting, man. I'm not going back over there to those crazy,
I got a
Celtic guys.
bag of gold coins. I'm gonna go.
Those naked guys with the blue paint on the body. Forget that. No more of that.
Yeah, really.
It has been absolutely wonderful to talk to you. David,
Thank
I
you.
know, like you said, that
Right.
you're working on a book. Can you give a heads up about that it's going to be about?
So I just started doing some research on the Rosicrucians. Like I mentioned earlier,
Right.
they're sort of
Okay.
a sect, and they're the ones. The Freemasons have all their rituals and stuff, but the Rosicrucians are the ones who are actually out during the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s.
Right.
They're trying to do chemical experiments to find the fountain of youth, to
Okay.
make the philosopher's stone, to turn mercury and lead into gold. And there's
Yes.
some evidence that they succeeded. So I'm looking at that, and I'm using that sort of to trigger the next book. It's tentatively entitled "The Rosy Cross" because that's what Rosicrucian
Right.
means, Rosy
The
Cross.
Rosicrucian.
So the Rosy
Exactly.
Cross, and the one I just did before that was called "One Nation Under John," which goes
Okay.
into the whole idea that the Templars may have been worshippers of John the
The
Baptist.
Baptist.
Yeah,
That's
because
very
he played a
interesting.
big part of He's a big part. Plays a big part in the Templar rituals and also in Freemasonry. The Freemasons, they always dedicate their lodges on Saint John the Baptist's birthday, and
Well,
the
the
grand
feast day for St. John the Baptist just came by June 24th.
June
And
24th,
you know
exactly.
what? And there's a lot of, and I'm not going to get into it, but there's a lot of stuff, symbology tied into the summer solstice being so
Summer
close to
solstice,
John the Baptist,
very much so.
uh,
When you think
the
about,
feast day.
Jesus is the winter solstice, and John the
Yeah.
Baptist is the summer solstice.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a big
People
part of
don't
it.
realize.
It's a huge
Hmm.
part of it. And
And people
who knows if
don't
those are actually
realize.
real dates or not, but that's a big part. So John the Baptist, the idea, the Templars, it may have been the Templars. One of the things they discovered in Jerusalem was that John the Baptist was really supposed to be the Messiah, and then he was
Right.
killed, and Jesus sort of stepped in. But that's the kind of belief that the church would say to the Templars, no, 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 no.
No, you're not going to do that now. No.
Talking about
Yeah,
that. But that was a
absolutely.
book I just finished a few months ago, One Nation Under John, and that's sort of a controversial book if you're
Right. If you don't want
people
to
don't want
look
to
at
read
an
that.
alternate
Yeah, but if you're
alternate
interested in the John the
version of
Baptist, that kind of
Christianity.
stuff, that was a fun book to research also.
Yes. 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 And even more prior, as far as sacrifices, even human sacrifices, there was a lot done around these solstice dates. They
Yes.
had a lot of significance, even from ancient times, prior to Judeo-Christian beliefs. There was
When I
a
met,
lot.
yeah, when I mentioned the America Stonehenge, the sacrificial stone that the Phoenicians were
Mm-hmm.
using, the
Yeah.
Phoenicians in the Bible they're called Canaanites, and in the Bible the Canaanites often sacrificed the
Yes.
children of their enemies, and they did it on the summer solstice because they
Mm,
worshiped the sun god
right.
Baal. And so
Paul.
maybe
Yes.
what was going on at that sacrificial stone that I was talking about was sacrificing children on the summer solstice, as you said.
Sure.
So yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
That is. And yeah, oh yeah. I mean, we could go for,
We could keep going for hours. Yeah.
oh boy, yeah. I mean, yeah. Talk about the rabbit hole.
Yep. The 15 years for me. Still,
Yeah, boy, yeah,
still
and
ferreting
still
around.
going, right?
Yeah, still going around.
Again, thank you so much. It has
My
been
pleasure.
wonderful to speak to you. I want to wish you the best of luck. So, and I know that you told me, okay, you got a 6 month timeline for the book, right?
Right. Every six, I write them every 6 months. I've been on a good schedule for the past 3 or 4 years, starting with the pandemic, because what else are you going to do?
Right,
But I put
exactly.
out
It's like,
2 a year. I start every year on July 1st and January 1st, and I just write till they're done, and then I start over. So as long as I keep finding things to write about, um,
oh yeah,
cross
there's
my
plenty.
fingers. But it's a lot of fun. I have a ton of fun researching, and
Sure,
also doing things like tonight, talking about it. So my
absolutely,
wife is like,
absolutely.
"Good, talk to somebody else about it. Finally, I'm sick of talking about it."
No, it's great, and like you said, with the internet, it facilitates a lot of the research part.
Right.
The legwork versus going to a library, which once upon a time, that's exactly how you did research.
Yeah,
You
and
know,
I did that, but it's just so much more efficient to be able to just click on your computer
oh,
and everything comes up. So really,
and
it
just
makes it
check
a
your
lot easier.
sources and make sure that that they're like, what's their source or whatever, where they'd come up with whatever they came up with. But yeah,
That is one of the
absolutely.
dangers of internet research is sometimes people just repeat the same lie over and over.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah, so you got to be
exactly.
careful.
It's like, where'd you get this from? But yeah, but who they get them from? And yeah, basically, you got to do like a little bit of digging to find out what's the
Yeah,
original source on something. Again,
Definitely.
David, thank you so much. And I will keep an eye out for your book, and maybe we can come back and we can talk about that book when it's published.
Great. Love to. Thank you. Thank you, Marlene. Yes.
Okay, take care. Good luck to you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Wow. Oh, let's see. My computer's running kind of slow. There. I click on stuff and it's like, yeah, it's dragging its butt. Anyway, guys, I hope you like that. I love talking to David about all these theories about alternate history. Well, no, I take that back. Even though he writes fiction, it's not alternate, it's possible history. And again, I like to hear, um, and of course, backed by facts like what he said, that sometimes there's more to history than what we learn in school or even what you read in regular history books. And I totally agree with him. Sometimes altering it to what it really is, you stumble over the egos of some academics or whoever came up with the theory or the proof, not even a theory. Oh, we made this discovery, and come to find out there was other things that proved maybe that wasn't entirely accurate. In other words, it was accurate maybe at that point in time, but other discoveries have been made afterwards that say, well, there's a possibility, as in, hey, this thing of Christopher Columbus, sailing to America as a discovery. No, there was more to it. Just that they were motivated for different reasons. Right? Maybe the people that came up, whether they were the Vikings or even the Phoenicians, yeah, maybe what they were blown off course and they decided to come back. And or in this case, if you go with this theory of the Templars, which I think is very plausible, by the way, that you've learned a hard way that maybe there is no safe place in Europe where you can stash your gold or your treasure or whatever it is that they had. Who knows what else they might have had? It maybe it wasn't just, maybe there was some type of relic, something so important that they said, you know what, we can hang out in Scotland, but that's too close for comfort. We got to find another place where we could take the stuff to, that we don't have to worry. In other words, whoever's going to come and try to get this is going to have to know how to sail across this piece of sea and then get here and then try to find it. In other words, they made it as difficult as they possibly could to locate it. And then we get to the very interesting idea of when only certain people know certain information, as in locations, you always think about, especially if it's either, oh, I'm going to give you this piece of paper, or the oral tradition, let me whisper this secret in your ear, by the way, that you know what, it's in this place. Nobody's guaranteed to die of old age, coherent, and with enough time to call the next person in line and tell them the secret, whatever it is. People die unexpectedly. They get run over. They die from an aneurysm. I mean, there's no guarantee that that moment that you can pass on the information is going to be there. And like all secrets, you think, okay, more than one person knows, but if you're trying to keep something a secret, it's going to be only a select amount of people that know it. In other words, a small number. So it works great for keeping a secret, but it works against you if for some reason the amount of people that know it die. Something happens to them. It does. Pestilence. What if the people that know it, everybody dies because, a fever rages through wherever they're at? Things like that happen. Or what if as you get older, you develop a version of dementia or Alzheimer's where you forget all these things that maybe you knew, and yeah, you live to be an old person, but you can't pass on that information. You think, well, yeah, things like that. This is, we live in a times of available knowledge, ready knowledge. Like he said, all you have to do is click on a browser and find the information and start tracking it down. But and again, remember, these are the times, These are pre-printing press times. This is, where you could make books. In other words, stuff had to be handwritten. And like I said, sometimes you had certain libraries that kept certain things, or in this case, monasteries, because these monks knew how to write. But my point being, even something that was written, it could be easily misplaced or torn up or burned down. There's a million reasons why secrets really became secret, as in nobody knew. And then, of course, you know, and also why maybe some of the clues that they gave were very, what's the word I'm looking for? They're not clear, because some people think, well, why can't they just say, hey, do this, do that, and it's under the tree with a thick, everything sounds like, I don't know if you've ever heard of these predictions by Nostradamus, that you listen to these quatrains and it was like, okay, guy, man, why couldn't you just say that this is going to happen? It was very, and of course, there's always the theory that, you didn't want to get in trouble with the church, and for whatever. But yeah, and it's almost like, why make it so difficult? But, we see it from our perspective. But if you're somebody who wants to give a clue, as in a clue, but you don't want to facilitate for somebody to find something that maybe you took across the ocean and buried or secreted somewhere, then you make it difficult. The problem again comes in when whoever has that knowledge, they lose track of it. And that can happen. That can absolutely happen. And or, maybe somebody has that treasure and put it away somewhere else. In other words, yes, the knowledge was passed on. Let's say we're moving forward as the decades or whatever, and the knowledge, and somebody said, hey, you know what? Go take that treasure, whatever, fill in the blank, whatever it is, artifact, relic, whatever we bought that's so, and we're going to move it to this other place. That happens. For all we know, that treasure is being kept someplace in a private collection, or somebody's aware of it, and they're watching the guys on Oak Island saying, hey, guys, that was there about 400 or 500 years ago, but not anymore. Nobody's going to say. Again, I wasn't kidding. I'm telling you, there's a lot of stuff in private collections, and they're private for a good reason. Like, what was it? About a year ago, there was a story that came out about this lady who finds what she thinks is a reproduction of a marble, a Roman statue marble head. She thinks it's a reproduction, pays $30 for it at the Goodwill. Come to find out, it's an original first century statue. I can't remember if it was an emperor, somebody, or a god, somebody. The thing is priceless to make. And, once she came out and it came out there, guess what? She had to return it to Italy. They kind of they proved where it had originally come from. And the most she could help, and they didn't publicize, the most she could hope for was that they were going to give her some little bit of money, like, hey, lady, thanks for finding this in the Goodwill. And they made a replica of it, like whoopee-doo. But here you can have your Roman head thing. But this thing of the finders keepers, not all the times. Yeah, let's put it this way: finders keepers if you keep your mouth shut. Private collection kind of deal. Because nowadays, if they can trace that whatever it is, treasure, statue, piece of whatever, was either stolen, or I think you can't, how can I say this? But belongs maybe to a person. In other words, maybe the country of origin doesn't own it anymore. And let's say a family can provide legitimate proof that, hey, or a museum, that we bought that piece legitimately. All right. It ends up going back basically to the point of origin. All right. So yeah. So if you ever find any treasure, go find an attorney first. So anyway, guys, I hope you like this interview with David Brody. By all means, look up all his books, and I've got a lot of interesting guests coming on. Don't forget to sign up for my newsletter on Substack. And again, whether you want to see a video version of any of the shows or a podcast version, go to miamighostchronicles.com, mpellicer.com. Just links to everything there. And I've got, like I said, a lot of interesting folks coming on that I know you're going to enjoy. So until next time. Take care.